Welcome everyone. My name is Gökhan Şen from Law Transform, and I would like to warmly welcome you to this Law Transform seminar today. The Center on Law and Social Transformation aims to understand how rights and law are used as tools for social change, and to what extent by research collaboration around the world. Law Transform is a collaboration between the researchers in the Chris Institute and University of Bergen. And it has many research affiliates around the world, including the United States, India, Latin America, Middle East, and Europe. I encourage you to check our webpage and Facebook page for the events and upcoming events. We have 2 or 3 events per week, so you don't want to miss them. Today we will be talking about Constitution and Metropolis, and we have with us Professor Hirschl. So I had a very bit of hard time to filter his resume, not to steal the time from his brilliant speech, but let me introduce him for you. Hirschl is a professor of government and law at Texas University, the University of Texas at Austin. He is also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, which is the highest award, academic award in that country. He has published several books, award-winning books on comparative constitutional law. He's also an author of more than 120 articles and book parts regarding that subject, which is in the intersection of constitutional law and comparative political science. Today, particularly, Professor Hirschl is going to talk about his latest book, City, State, Constitutionalism, and the Megacity. The importance of this book regarding Bergen is, first, it won the Stein Rokkan Prize, which is named after our co-citizen. Second, this event is a human rights city event, which is also one of the cases that Professor Hirschl examines in detail. Human Rights City event collaboration between Law Transform, Rafta Foundation, and Church Mission of Bergen. So before giving him the floor, let me paraphrase some inspiring highlights from this brilliant book. The 21st century is hailed as the century of the megacities, and we witnessed an unprecedented growth of these cities. We are looking at cities with the inhabitants of 50 or 100 millions at the end of this century. Yet, our understanding of constitutionalism and constitutional law has not kept pace with this dazzling growth and expansion of the cities. So, I quote, "We desperately need new thinking about constitutionalism and urbanization." So, without further ado, I'll leave the floor to Professor Hirschl.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very generous introduction, and thank you all for coming. I know it's a busy time, the end of the semester, conferences, travel, all that, so I appreciate you coming. Again, my apologies that my Norwegian is very basic, so we'll have to conduct this in English. And before we start, I want to thank the center, and in particular, Professor Stein Rokkan, for coordinating this event and for inviting me here. Unfortunately, she couldn't come due to some health issues, but she's a long-time intellectual companion, and I'm grateful for everything she's done for our field and for the center and for me personally, so I'm happy to be here. With that in mind, let's jump straight in, and the format I understand of the event today will be, I'll be speaking for between 50 and 55 minutes, something like that, with the PowerPoint presentation that is fairly extensive. So there is a big board here, so you should be able to see and see well. And then there will be a quick panel discussion with, I believe, 2 or 3 experts that will offer their comments and different perspectives, and then we'll open the floor for about as much as we can for questions from the audience that we'll try to address. All right, so we have a lot to cover, so let's jump straight in. And as was introduced already, it means a lot to be here because this book that I will be talking about today, City State, was very fortunate, and its author was very fortunate to win the Stein Rokkan Prize in 2021. It's I don't know how familiar you are with that, but it's a big deal in the social science. It is a big deal. I know I'm in the Nordic world and I'm supposed to be humble, but it's a big deal. And the prize, of course, the namesake is known to all of you and probably fellow citizen, but intellectual citizen #1, at least in comparative politics, that this great university has produced. So it means a lot. I studied Rokkan's work in my PhD studies in graduate school some quarter century ago. So when the announcement of the prize came, I was really stunned and humbled. So I'm happy to be here. Okay. So what I'm going to introduce to you today, the book covers several big themes, as was said, at the intersection of urbanization and constitutional silence. And what are we to make of the tension between the rise of cities around the world and the silence of one of the most significant, if not the most significant governing tool we have in public law, and what to make of the silence. I'm going to present to you 3 major themes from the book. The first one is the century of the city, global challenge, constitutional silence. Okay, so this graph is available online. You can find it in 30 seconds, and it portrays the rise of urbanization over the last 2 centuries. It speaks for itself and needs no introduction, but we can definitely see that around here, we begin to see tremendous growth, and the 20th century has been hailed. If we cut the thing here, we see that the 20th century has been hailed as the century of the city, and the data speaks for itself, need not dwell on that. That's another way of presenting the essentially same data, the decline, relative decline, and in the last couple of decades, absolute number decline in rural population around the world, and the tremendous rise in urban population. So the trend is obvious. So here is where it begins to be perhaps slightly more sophisticated. What we have here is the purple line at the top represents world population in billions since 1950, so the last 60, 70 years. And the blue line at the bottom there represents urban population in billions. And we see that the purple line and the blue line are roughly parallel. So the translation of this is that the vast majority of growth in world population has translated immediately into growth in urban population. So the growth of urban population is almost 1-to-1 correlated with the growth of world population. Don't be scared about all these numbers. We're not going to, there is no exam at the end of the lecture, and we are not going to go through all of this in detail. But what we have here is, so basically there are 2 tables here. This is the left part, and we have population of, or proportion rather, of urban population as total of, as percentage of total population. And here we have the absolute numbers. And I think if we can just zoom, so obviously there is some growth in Europe in absolute numbers over the years, as well as in North America. But if we look, and this is going to be a recurring theme in our lecture today, if we look at the so-called global south, we see, just focus for a minute on this line. You see that in 1960, there were essentially, I hope you can see the red dot here as I'm pointing, there were essentially 360 million people throughout Asia living in cities, and today we are in the vicinity of 2.5 billion and projected to arrive at 3.5 billion, so 10 times more over less than a century. And that's in Asia alone. If we compare to that, Africa, Latin America, we get a pretty mind-boggling, at least, picture. This is a translation of the same data into simple graph. And the green line here is Africa. I'm sorry, Asia. This here is Africa. And we can see the growth of urban population across continents, where there is some modest growth in Europe and in North America, but the vast majority of growth has taken place in the so-called global south. This is also a figure that speaks for itself, the rise in so-called megacities, and I will address in a minute how we define megacities, but again, it requires no further explanation. The trend is obvious, megacities over time, and so over the last half century, there has been a tremendous growth, and it is expected to continue to grow. Something about definitions. So the term megacity is a contested term in the sense that there are at least 4 definitions that may seem applicable to it. One is cities with population over 1 million. The other is over 5, over 10 in metro areas. So the whole aggregation or urban agglomeration. And the numbers here again speak for themselves, and there's no need to dwell on it, but we can see that city population with over 10 million, there was only one immediately after World War II, and we are currently in the vicinity of 40. And metro areas, it's a new phenomenon. We are currently standing at slightly over 50. So the real, I don't know if scary is the right word, but perhaps near-dystopian piece of data here is at the bottom, that UN projections for the end of the 21st century suggest that a quarter of the world's population will be living in the world's 100 largest cities. And that almost exclusively includes megacities in the global south. So Lagos, Kinshasa are projected to have approximately 85, some say about 90 million people for one city, yes? So this is a big deal, and it's definitely something that started over the last 5 decades and is projected to continue in the next century. One of the immediate byproducts of extensive urbanization is extreme density at the urban level. So this is something that anyone who lives in Bergen maybe finds it difficult to relate to. But you guys don't know how fortunate you are. Maybe you do. Manila is considered the densest city in the world today. And its density is measured. This is the entire city, not just separate neighborhoods. The entire city is measured at an average density of 48,000 people per square kilometer. The Bergen numbers, by comparison, 620. So in Bergen, there are 620 people per square kilometer. In Manila, 48,000. And that's equivalent to 21.5 million people living in Bergen alone. So that we understand in its, yes, I know, exactly. What? Yeah, exactly. And here you have, so that you don't think I'm latching on Bergen here, you see that it's well above many other cities. It is equivalent to the entire world population, 7.75 billion in half of Norway. And nowhere else in the world, so that we appreciate how dense this thing can get. And it's not even the densest form of living, because in so-called urban slums in the global south, the density even exceeds that of Dhaka and Manila. To the extent, and the dubious world record holder is Dharavi in Mumbai, with density of 300,000 people per square kilometer, and that's equivalent to the entire world population squeezed into Vermont or into Belgium. Now you do the math. That's what I would ask my son. Do the math. What's the proportion between half of Norway and the size of Belgium? But no, I'm just kidding. That's a math question. All right, let's move on. Well, that's another illustration of precisely the same data, just to, so if the numbers don't speak to you, hopefully that this one will. All right. And that's how it looks in Lagos in 2018, parts of Lagos, Nigeria. And that's the smog over Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the Americas. We'll go conceptually to Mexico City in about 10-15 minutes to understand what's going on. All right. So another dimension of this phenomenon is internal migration to cities. And here we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, that you can see for yourself. The GDP per capita rose 2.4 times over the last half century. The country's population rose 5.6 times over the last half century, yet the population of Kinshasa multiplied itself 42 times over that period. So clearly that is explained by major internal migration from the countryside to the city. And this is a phenomenon that is well known worldwide. And there are city countryside density gaps. You can see the data there. There's no need for us to dwell on the details. And it raises the possibility that I'm happy to address in the Q&A, that we begin to consider extreme involuntary density as a form of diversity. But that's a conceptual question that we can talk about, to what extent that extreme density affects living conditions. And if you want to talk Norway, we could talk about extremely low density in the far north, and I'm originally from Canada, so that's an issue that not only Norway faces, but it's the other side of the same coin. All right, so the trend is obvious. I mean, we are looking at a major global trend here, and I could go on and on with more and more data, but the trend is obvious. So the social sciences, the human sciences, have paid close attention to this, starting with classical works of political theory, from Plato to Marx, of course, and Machiavelli, etc. The city has been a center of imagination in terms of utopian revolutionary political thought, different alternative communities, etc. It has been the center of attention by recent social thinkers, novel thinking about urbanization and cities throughout the human sciences. Henri Lefebvre may be well known to some of you who do political theory, and his idea of the right to the city. We'll talk about it later if you wish. But also other major works such as Saskia Sassen's work on global cities and Richard Florida work on city and the creative classes, Paul Krugman's work on economies of scale that won the Nobel Prize not far from here, and of course Benjamin Barber's work on if mayors rule the world, and I could go on and on with other books. So the focus of the book that I wrote was to point to a stark gap between the major interest across the social sciences in this phenomenon that I just described in its various manifestations, and the fact that very little of this intellectual flurry has penetrated constitutional law. There is some attention in international law and the rise of cities as international actors to some extent, in particular with respect to the environment, sustainability. We'll talk about that later. But in constitutional law, very little, almost nothing. And that, I think, posed a puzzle to me and to other readers of the book. So why is this the case? And just to drive the point home here, here is a nice collection of three major textbooks, or leading textbooks in so-called comparative constitutional law, which is what I do. It's not the constitutional law of a given country, but a comparative account of constitutional arrangements around the world. And for the sake of full disclosure, I'm a contributor to two of those. So I'm as major culprit in this neglect as everyone else. And Here we have a collection of 130 pages, almost 130 chapters, almost 3,000 pages, with nothing on cities as autonomous conceptual entities in constitutional law. So then I begin to speculate, why is this the case? How are we to explain the gap between the overwhelming data and interest in the social sciences on the rise of the city and urban agglomeration throughout the world, and the silence, almost complete silence? It's not even exaggeration silence, not a metaphor. It's a silence. There's nothing, very little. And then I come up with a few arguments or ideas to suggest why this silence, or why this gap. So of course, number one is constitutional rigidity and path dependence. Constitutions are hard to change, and it's difficult to make adjustments and takes time. So that's well known, and path dependence, both constitutionally and intellectually, of constitutional thinkers. But maybe there is a set of deeper things there. I argue in the book that the overarching conceptualization of space in constitutional law is fundamentally Westphalian or statist, and is based on the notion that there is the modern state and its subnational units. But it's difficult for a conceptualization of public law or of constitutional law as statist fundamentally to imagine or to accommodate alternative divisions within the Westphalian order, so that the Westphalian order is not fundamentally challenged. If you will, there may be an equivalent challenge by, say, indigenous populations to the Westphalian notion. It's a different set of understanding and conceptualization of territory, sovereignty, and space. I also speculate that cities, unlike capital, and this is a matter of fact, are fixed in place. So it's difficult to talk about capital flight with respect to cities. So the capital may leave and go somewhere else, but cities are stuck in place, and so their bargaining power is rather limited. Cities are also may be perceived as potential competitors to the statist order in many respects, and in particular, fear of large cities as sites of potential mass mobilization. And this is not merely hypothetical. You will remember the pictures from Tahrir Square in Cairo, or riots in Hong Kong, or in the US cities following the terrible events that took place there in summer, when was that, 2020? And in Santiago de Chile, that brought about the constitutional revolution that the country is currently undergoing, etc. And finally, most large cities are consistently more diverse, cosmopolitan, and progressive, if you will, socially, than the rest of the country. And that may also be one of the reasons why the constitutional order is not crazy about accommodating. Again, I'm happy to talk about any of the details. So message number one, as a matter of fact, there is a tremendous gap between the rise of cities across the world and the silence of constitutional thinking about it. And I come up with a set of reasons why this is the case. Let's move on to the second theme I want to explore, which is the constitutional status today of cities. And I titled this Northern Stagnation, Southern Innovation, to highlight the fact that very little has been done in the global north to address the urban challenge, as opposed to some rather daring attempts in the so-called global south, granted not throughout the global south. We're talking about 150 countries, more or less, yes? But the most significant attempts today in constitutional law to address the urban challenge emanate from the so-called global south. So let's delve into some of it. To understand what is the innovative dimension of constitutionalism with respect to cities in the global south, we need to pay attention to what's going on in the global north. So I'm not sure how familiar most of you are with the constitutional order in the US, but with respect to cities, basically cities do not exist constitutionally. So in the United States, there are two doctrines. We can't go into details, but two constitutional doctrines that govern the status, or rather the non-status of cities. Generally speaking, cities are perceived as creatures of the states, are controlled by the states, and The two leading decisions of the US Supreme Court on the status of cities date back to 1903 and 1907. So it's been 120 years since major decisions have been rendered on the status of cities. Perhaps most significantly today, American states have what we call preemption rights. So they may legislate to preempt progressive legislation by cities. So if cities are interested in, say, adopting all, regulating gig economies, informal economy, regulating informal economy, if cities are interested in regulating that, the states may preempt that before the city legislation comes into place, and so on. So you get the picture. And so cities have been, generally speaking, subject to this preemption trend by conservative states, and it actually crosses party lines. It happens in California as much as it happens in Oklahoma. So there is something in the logic that the states cannot accommodate this autonomous behavior by cities. So now my home country of Canada is often perceived the more progressive and more socially progressive jurisdiction in North America. Not that there is much of a competition, but exactly, I want to hear you smile. Not that there is much of a competition, but my American fellows would be happy to hear that the status of Canadian cities in the Canadian constitutional order is even worse, to the extent that it is possible, than the status of American cities. So Canadian cities are commonly described as complete outcasts of Canadian federalism. Canada is a wonderful place in many other respects, but not when it comes to the constitutional status of cities. And the Canadian Constitution dates back, or the relevant parts of it dates back to 1867. And their cities are governed alongside shops, saloons, taverns, and charities, so that you understand. And this is the Constitution of 1867 is in place today with respect to what's going on here, right? So that's the status of cities today. And this is a combination, of course, of a 19th century binary federal provincial constitution, no place for cities, and the fact that it's very difficult to amend the Canadian Constitution, as it is difficult to amend the American Constitution. And what we have is cities that do not exist constitutionally. And in Canada, the problem is perhaps more severe than in the US because of climate issues that some 3/4 of the northern part of the country is not habitable. In Norway, you will sympathize with that. So the vast majority of people live in 5 or 6 big cities, relatively close to the American border. And so what we get here is that the city of Toronto, 7.5 million, that's 20% of Canada's population in one city, is governed alongside shops, taverns, and charities that we saw earlier. So why is this picture here, and who are these people anyhow? So we all hear all the time about the American founding fathers and all that. These are the founding fathers of the Canadian Constitution. And the chief among them is this guy, John A. Macdonald here. So why is this picture here? This is 1864. And you see how diverse this group is. All male, all white. And if you want to take a glimpse into the landscape, you see that urban, it is not. So the Constitution that these guys created in 1867 governs the by far most multicultural city around the world today, with 49% of Toronto's inhabitants first generation Canadians. 49%. Every second person in Toronto, those 7.5 million, was born somewhere else. And this is governed by a constitution that these guys created. Good luck. Okay, so I could go on and discuss the status of cities in Europe and elsewhere, but you get the picture. Let's set our gaze southward and see what kind of alternative models have emanated from that part of the constitutional universe. And here we see some interesting developments, some more relevant to us than others. So here is a model that is very interesting, but not quite relevant to the liberal democratic world and you know, to Europe and North America. Nonetheless, it's worth mentioning. And I call it in the book the Asian Tigers model. So the idea here is to elevate the status of certain major cities as economic hubs of, you know, development to a similar constitutional status of any other subnational unit, like a state or a province or land in German terms. And so China was the first to introduce this model by elevating 4 major cities into, or giving 4 major cities a constitutional status equivalent to that of any other autonomous or semi-autonomous region within China. And so that you think that this is a purely Chinese authoritarian model, it is not. So South Korea did the same, and other countries such as Vietnam and Taiwan have followed this model, hence the Asian Tigers model. And again, make no mistake, this is not driven by democratization or by attempt to any bottom-up attempt to empower the people or empower cities, the people. It is driven by an attempt to govern the economy and to control development, urban and regional, by giving major cities, we're talking cities of 30 million in China, giving cities more effective governing tools with very little democratization ideals in mind. So that's the first model. And the second, which is much more interesting for our purposes, is the bottom-up national constitutional renewal model. And here we talk about 3 leading examples, all from the so-called global south. The first country to address this is Brazil. As part of the transition constitution in 1988 from the military regime to the democracy, questionable as it may be, that Brazil has become over the last 35 years or so. The Constitution of Brazil in 1988 was the first to attempt to constitutionalize the so-called right to the city. And it includes provisions that make strong protection of the right of city dwellers and city leadership to make decisions for the city autonomously from the state and the federal government. I'll show you the effects in a minute. India followed suit in 93 with the 73rd and 74th amendments. It's a slightly different model and has been less successful than the Brazilian model. And arguably the most successful model on offer today when it comes to comparative constitutionalism is the South African model. As part of transition from apartheid in the mid-90s to the new Constitution of South Africa that came into effect in 96, 97, South Africa adopted a whole chapter in its constitution, 14 provisions no less, that grant cities full control over land use, planning, social housing, etc. Since we discussed briefly what the US Constitution, how the US Constitution, the Canadian Constitution address cities, we'll see the exact opposite here. So these are just 3 random provisions from that chapter of the South African Constitution. We'll just read one of them. The national or a provincial government may not compromise or impede a municipality's ability or right to exercise its powers or perform its functions. You compare that to the preemption business that I talked about before, never mind the non-existent status of Canadian cities, and you see how direct opposite it is. We could go on and on, but you get the picture. What has been the impact of this constitutionalization of city rights in South Africa? Quite dramatic. The Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court of South Africa, played along with this transformation, and in 2010, in a landmark decision involving the city of Johannesburg, decided to adopt this new spirit of the 96-97 Constitution and ruled that the city of Johannesburg actually has those rights, including control of, land, land designation, planning, etc. And that has led to the immediate adoption in Johannesburg of a very progressive and generous social housing scheme that essentially warrants that every development project with more than 20 units must designate 30% of the units to social housing. This is radical. If you take the South African context of, up during the apartheid years and all the tremendous social and economic rights and the differences and gaps in that context, you'll understand. And what is this building here? Anyone? This is the Constitutional Court of South Africa in Pretoria. And I put it here so we understand the multicultural context. So this is the name of the Constitutional Court in all the official languages of South Africa, including some native languages, including Afrikaans. So the language of apartheid. All of this is. So completely compare this to the US, completely different ball game, so to speak. Okay. A third model, I hope you're still with me, a third model in the so-called Global South that is different approach is the constitutionalization of one city, not across the board, but one city. And what I call here the single city constitutional emancipation. And the leading example on this is Mexico City. So I don't know how many of you have been there, but it's a big place. So 25, depending on how you count, between 20 and 30 million, depending on where you draw the line. It is considered the second largest mega city in the Americas. Sao Paulo is the largest. So it's vast. In 2013, Mexico City started a process of self-emancipation that, due to political reasons within Mexico, was accepted and even promoted by the federal government. And so in 2017, the process was completed and Mexico City shifted its status from being a federal territory like Washington, DC, or Canberra in Australia, to an autonomous state within the Mexican Confederation. So it's like any other state in Mexico. It's practically a city-state. I'm not talking 25 million people here. And interestingly enough, it also involved the largest, roughly 20 million people, exercise to date at the urban level of constitution making via moderated crowdsourcing. So people would text in all sorts of things that they want to see in the Constitution. So public participation, big time. And that resulted in the so-called CDMX Constitution. A really unique experience, too early to call what its impact will be. It's been just 4 or 5 years. So just to give you a sense of how progressive this thing is, let's zoom in on the environment. And by the way, the Mexico City Constitution is by far the most progressive in Mexico with respect to LGBT rights, most progressive in Mexico with respect to the right to have an abortion. It's much more progressive than the vast majority of American states. So that we put this in context. Here, I zoomed in on a couple of provisions pertaining to environmental protection and climate change. And you can see for yourself, there's no need for me to read from the board, but you can see for yourself how progressive, at least in intention, this thing is. The impact of that model on practical environmental protection. Again, Mexico City is too early to call. It's been 4 or 5 years. And everyone who visited Mexico City will know that it's a place that's difficult to govern and difficult to change. But we do have some perspective on this model from Buenos Aires that underwent a similar process in '94. So it's been almost 3 decades, similar process of constitutionalization of a single city. And we can see that there, the environmental impact has been fairly significant. Buenos Aires is widely considered the greenest, so to speak, city in the Americas. In the Americas, as in North Pole all the way to the South Pole, which is Latin America. Far greener than many American and Canadian cities. Okay, so bottom line of theme number 2 is, as I called it, Northern stagnation, Southern innovation. And I could go on and on with more models from the Global South, but I think suffices to say that we compared quickly what's the status of cities in the US and in Canada to what's the status of cities or developments in the Global South with 3 different models: the top-down model in Asia, the bottom-up model in Brazil, India, and South Africa, and then the constitutional emancipation of a single city, as in Mexico City or Buenos Aires. The third and final thing I want to explore in this talk is other avenues and possibilities, perhaps within constitutional law, to make a difference. So not in all places, constitutional revolution or constitutional amendment are possible. So what other options are available for cities in the 21st century? And remember the data that I showed you to begin with. So the urge to do something will only become stronger and stronger. What other available options are there? So here is where in the introduction was mentioned, and I understand, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, that Bergen was made a human rights city in 2018, 2019, is that correct? So that's lovely. So just to put this phenomenon in perspective, it does not require, so those of you who do not know what a human rights city is, the idea is that the municipality adopts some international treaties or commits itself to some international human rights promises and guarantees at the municipal level, and pledges to behave or to legislate to the extent it controls certain areas, taking into account those provisions. Again, I'm not familiar with a particular situation in Bergen, but I will talk about, here you have a number of really path-breaking examples. So the first big city in the global north to do this was actually San Francisco. It's one of the most progressive, as you know, urban centers in North America. And what it did, it incorporated the provisions of CDAW concerning elimination of gender discrimination into its municipal laws, and it has been there ever since. And it's fairly effective in hiring procedures within the city, etc. To be clear, at the national constitutional level, this is not recognized. San Francisco can do whatever it wants. When it goes to the Supreme Court, you know, it'll shoot it down in 5 minutes. No pun intended. With the shooting. Okay. In Korea, Gwangju, same story, separate context. Some of you will know the historical context and the significance of that city and the struggle for independence in South Korea and anti-autocracy struggle. Tokyo was certain neighborhoods of Tokyo. We're talking 40 million people, yes. Did something like that in 2015 in a different version. And the most radical attempt in 2021 actually belongs to New York City, that for the first time essentially allowed for urban citizenship. And of course, citizenship comes from city. It tells you how significant city used to be, yes, in Western political thought. So New York City now allows legally documented non-citizens to participate in all sorts of municipal elections in New York City. And the pioneer there was actually Amsterdam. So perhaps it's interesting that the new Amsterdam is the current leader in that respect. So all of these are different dimensions of so-called human rights cities. And just to be 100% clear, the national constitutional order is not in love with this phenomenon. And in most cases, it controls what happens within municipalities, but has very little purchase beyond that. Here is where maybe I'll go through this briefly because I don't know how many lawyers there are in the room. But here, another alternative that may be considered is drawing on already existing constitutional doctrines, not related specifically to urban governance, to enhance the status of cities. And without going into details, subsidiarity is a basic principle in governance that many of you will be familiar with. So to the extent that we can delegate power to closest to the people and make decisions closest to the people as possible, that's preferable. And that is entrenched in the so-called emerging EU constitution, including, Maastricht and Lisbon. Margin of appreciation is, I'm sure, known to all of you who go to law school here, and the idea of deference to local authorities that has been widely invoked by the European Court of Human Rights. Jurisprudence and community standards, again, these are legal concepts. Again, since this is not a lecture in law school, we'll skip that or skip a big, detailed discussion of this, but I'm happy to come back to it later. While we are on the emerging EU constitution, another strategy that some cities have taken, in Europe particularly, over the last decade, is turning directly to the European Court of Justice or the European Court of Human Rights to assert their authority to regulate all sorts of areas. And a landmark, relatively unknown, but landmark decision of the European Court of Justice from 2020 involving Airbnb, and some of you might have heard of Anne Hidalgo, the very proactive and progressive mayor of Paris, who initiated this litigation. And the idea was, we all know what Airbnb is and how they'll say inadvertently, but essentially push housing prices up by taking many housing units out of the long-term rental, or never mind purchasing and ownership market. So it's short-term rental. And so cities like Paris and Florence and Madrid and Barcelona, etc., have been major victims of this because tourists flock in, and so the price of housing has gone up. And so the European Court of Justice ruled in a rather important decision that the city of Paris has the right to regulate short-term rentals based on some provisions of the European Union economic agreement. Another alternative at the more constitutional theory level is to try to conceptualize cities as an alternative space. And as providing an alternative human experience. It's not just an aggregation of people. It has, and not just denser and not just big and just as many buildings. The very super diversity of people who live in cities might make the city a different space, a different forum, a different entity. And so the notion of super diversity, essentially intersecting elements of diversity, is just as sexual diversity or gender diversity or racial diversity or religious diversity or linguistic diversity. It's all of this at the same time, all the time. Because every time we go out, we encounter it. And so maybe, and what you have here is just data on how more diverse big cities are, and in the parentheses here is the national average of that country. So, for example, Toronto, 49% are first-generation Canadians as compared to 22% throughout the country. And from there, you can extrapolate. So the data speaks for itself, and I'm sure it's relevant for Oslo and Bergen as well, to the extent that they may be considered megacities in the Norwegian context. Certainly Oslo is. It speaks for itself. So the idea here is to attempt to conceptualize the city as a substantively different space based on super diversity. Another element, or are we doing with time? Yes, 5-7 more minutes if you bear with me. Another element is cities as public alternative to private power. And this, it may not be a problem in Norway. I don't know. I speak as a complete ignorant here. But it is definitely a big time problem in North America, and in particular in the United States. Because cities are anchored in place, have zero or close to zero constitutional rights, are preempted on a yearly basis by cities. They vie for economic resources. And for lack of a better term, they need corporate money in order to govern effectively, in order to compete. So they begin to cut taxes for big corporate entities to lure corporate money into the city. And they do this at the expense of commitments to the environment, commitments to housing, commitments to education, commitments to hospitals and so on, safety and so on. And some of the things you've heard about, the Amazon, headquarter 2, And what you have here is this thing. We're talking Boston, just to be clear. This is the place of Harvard, MIT, you know, a top city in many respects. Preparing the brochure to Amazon to convince the Amazon guys who paid 0 taxes in 2018 and 2019 why they should come to Boston. We are, you know, like a real estate person who tries to sell an apartment. The city of Boston. Just think about this, the place of some of the greatest universities and greatest minds in the world. And what we have here is the word ludicrous doesn't even capture it. Really, it's beyond ludicrous, below ludicrous, I should say. The city of Chicago essentially went down financially in 2008. And so the mayor and the city sold public parking rights to, I know, it's unbelievable, sold public parking rights throughout the city to Morgan Stanley. That's right. And the real financiers of the deal were somewhere in the United Arab Emirates, not even Morgan Stanley. So for something like 65 years or 75 years, if I'm doing the math correctly here, Morgan Stanley paid $1.15 billion, which may seem a lot to you, but we're talking about, it's close to nothing when we talk about public parking rights for 75 years. In 2021, the initial investment has been recouped, and now there are 63 or 62 more years of net benefit. Every time you park your car in Chicago, think about that. Okay. Some tensions along the same line exist in Europe as well. So it's easy to, you know, to bash America all the time, and it's too easy. Some tensions along these lines exist in Europe as well, and some of you might have heard about the struggle in Berlin, the bottom-up struggle in Berlin to expropriate the housing market and to make sure, to control housing prices and rental prices. It's an ongoing struggle. The German Federal Constitutional Court ruled a number of occasions, and predominantly in a big decision in 2021, that rent cap in Berlin violates certain provisions of the German Constitution, including the right to property and others. So it's easy to bash America, but tensions, moderate tensions along these lines, you know, private entities, private money versus public interest is something that happens in other places as well. Not as radical, not on steroids as everything in America seems to be, but it's happening elsewhere. Maybe 2 more points and then I'll close. Another problem that cities have around the world is constitutionally entrenched malapportionment. The idea that the vote or the voice of an urban dweller counts less than the vote or the voice of those who occupy other forms of habitation. And this happens predominantly in first past the post. So Norwegian system is one of the most advanced in the world, critical as you may be about it. I don't know, it's functioning relatively well in terms of reflecting popular will on the outcome. To the extent that I'm not an expert, to the extent that I understand the system. It's a very different story in first past the post systems. We don't have the time to go into details, but research has shown that there is this basic tendency in first past the post electoral systems, and that include the US and Canada and Australia and the UK and India and Brazil, parts of the electoral system in Brazil and Pakistan and many other places, Nigeria, all the big sites of urbanization, to dilute urban vote through to all sorts of constitutionally entrenched malapportionment. And so what we get in the US What is this? Is this a COVID-19 virus? No, it's not. It's an electoral district in Texas, around Austin. In the US, we have, what we call gerrymandering. And so this is actually introduced by the Democrats to enhance urban power. You can't change the Constitution, you can't change the Constitution of Texas. So what you do, you play with electoral districts. So what we get here is Austin here, that is island of progressivism, and San Antonio here, ditto, and a highway that connects them. So because you can't do anything, I know it's unbelievable. This is 2022 electoral district in the US of A. That's how it looks. And again, lest we think that Canada is perfect, here are two electoral districts in Canada. In Canada, it's a different story, but maybe equally problematic. Here we have two electoral districts in Ontario. Ontario is the province within which, oh, what did I do? Not good. Yeah, okay, don't lose faith. I will be done. I will be done in 5 minutes. Promise.
So the screen itself is shutting down, and I need to wait another 17 seconds.
Keep on talking, kill time.
You can.
I think I'm talking too much. Anyways, so just to go back to the slides that we saw, in Canada it's a different principle, but the long and short of it, to save time, is that in rural districts, there are far fewer people than in urban districts, and the demographics in urban districts is different and much more multicultural and diverse, etc. So although despite all these differences, both districts send similar amount of representatives to the national parliament. And so the outcome, de facto, is that urban interests and multicultural and diversity interests and the interests of immigrants, etc., are less represented, and other urban interests are less represented. Okay, can I continue? Beautiful, thank you, Matilda. So here we have an urban district, and you see the demographics there to the right, and here we have a rural district, and you see the demographics there, and it speaks for itself. And both are represented by an equal number of MPs, one. So, so it speaks for itself. And I could go on and on. There are over 300 of those, but you get the picture. So, as I said, in first past the post systems, and here you have the list that I mentioned earlier, it's an inherent bias. And another problem is the Chicago-Zurich problem. So it's a progressive enclave within a conservative subnational unit. So the urban voice is diluted and is not swallowed. So in the book, I delve into, obviously we don't have the time for this, delve into all sorts of ideas concerning alternative electoral systems to compensate for the dilution of the urban voice. The last thing I'll mention here is intra-city inequalities and the constituent unit question. So some of you might know what fiscal equalization is. This is the idea very common in federations, in federal countries, the idea of transfer of resources and money from the have states to the have not states, right? Based on national solidarity, etc. And this is how effective this thing is in Germany. It's quite effective. So here we have pre-equalization gaps among Länder in Germany. Before equalization, there are two steps. We won't go into details. That's what happens after equalization. Okay, so it's effective in closing the gaps. But there are problems with this notion because it is based exclusively on well-established Länder, states, provinces, cantons, subnational units. It doesn't look into socioeconomic gaps within those subnational units. It treats the unit as the exclusive unit of analysis, the exclusive constituent unit, if you will, constitutionally speaking. And so Another example from Canada here, this is Ontario, that as you see, I think Canada has the same procedure like in Germany, simplified. So what you have here is the provinces. The red is what they have before equalization. The blue is what they get after equalization. And you see that Ontario is here, ON, that's where Toronto is, 50% of the province. And it's not a major recipient, it's not a major giver, so to speak. Yes, it's roughly average. But when we look at what happens within the metropolitan center of Ontario, we see that is not accounted for by the subnational unit matrix. We see those big differences of 1 to 6 among the richest neighborhoods and the poorest neighborhoods. And the gap in Chicago, since we talked about Chicago, I have a long list of cities in the book, is 1 to 12. And in Mumbai, it's 1 to 21. And all of these are intra metropolis differences. All of this is wiped off completely in an equalization system that is only based on the state, so to speak, or the subnational unit as its conceptual constituent. I hope point taken. Okay, so the final slide I'll show is those neighborhood by neighborhood differences in Sao Paulo, Brazil, the largest megacity in the Americas, some 30 million. It speaks for itself. I hope you appreciate the work that went into this, and as well as all the other data. It speaks for itself. You know, you work for, as you all know, as researchers, you work for 4 months on something, and in the end, it's 1 slide. You know how these things are. So what we have here is, of course, the well-off neighborhood within Sao Paulo with domestic migration. Remember Congo that we talked about, domestic migration of 6%, 300 people per square kilometer, a life expectancy of 80 years. 10 kilometers from there, 10 kilometers, I repeat, subway. You can take it metro. That's what we get here. Domestic migration of almost 60%, so 6 of every 10 people are not from there. It's domestic migration. And density, you can see for yourself, and the life expectancy is, yes, you read it correctly, 25 years less than in the first neighborhood we looked at. That is just within the city of Sao Paulo. And the same with the other neighborhood. And at the other end of the state. And all of this is completely wiped off in the system that is based on equalization state by state, because all of this is within the state of Sao Paulo. So basically the rich, to put it bluntly, are hiding behind this subnational unit conceptualization to help the system overlook all those intra-metropolis differences. Mumbai, no need to talk, speaks for itself. Neighborhood by neighborhood differences. Yes, a sigh of relief, I'm done. And from you at least, I could talk about this day and night. I'm done. So the bottom line of what I presented to you over the last, I don't know, 60 minutes or so, well, we know it's 60 minutes because the system went down, is this. Urban agglomeration is among the most burning global policies challenges we face as humanity today. I would rank it as second or third to the problem of climate change. It's up there and it's connected to one another. These are inseparable. So if we want to think seriously about the environment, we need to think seriously about urban agglomeration. We have tremendous amount of innovation throughout the human sciences talking about it. We have almost nothing in public law and nothing in constitutional law. The most significant body of laws that govern who we are and how we rule ourselves. Almost nothing. So in the face of such unequivocal evidence, I suggest from across the social sciences, or across the scientific spectrum, new thinking about constitutions and urbanization and the spatial dimension of constitutional governance more generally is the call of the hour. Thank you.